Hey everyone, it's Brennan. Welcome to my channel and welcome to another video. Today I have some springtime book recommendations. I'm filming this and it's actually St. Patrick's Day. It's March 17th and it has been so delightfully kind of warm, like upper 60s lately, and it is just speaking to me. I rearranged a lot of my plants yesterday and took some plant progress pictures. Maybe I'll insert a few of them here. And I have this planty shirt on. I don't even know if you can see that. And all of that was kind of making me think of some books that kind of fit the feel right now. I'm a very ambient reader. I really like books that fit the mood of the weather around me. Maybe I should just say I'm a mood reader, but I feel like I've already established that fact. Anyway, I have 10 book recommendations that kind of put me in the mind of spring. I have these organized by genre, so first I'm going to recommend a couple romance books, and first I'm going to recommend Christina Lauren's My Favorite Half-Night Stand. I don't hear a lot of people talk about this one when they talk about Christina Lauren. Mainly I hear The Honeymooners and Josh and Hazel's Guide to Not Dating, but I really liked My Favorite Half-Night Stand, and this makes me feel springy because it's set at a university, and the characters in this book are like young university professors, and they are getting ready for graduation. I think I didn't look back into this, but I think they are preparing for Barack Obama to speak at their graduation ceremony. I might be wrong with that, but they're looking for dates, and they all sign up for this dating app. And our main character, her name's Millie, she's kind of like the only girl in their friend group, and at first they were all like, well, who's going to get to take Millie? And she kind of has a crush on one of the guys in her friend group. But anyway, she makes a fake profile on this dating app and ends up matching with the guy she has a crush on, but she doesn't want him to know that it's her. Something I like a lot in this book is that the steam starts pretty early on in it, and I just like the setting, I like our characters, I like the premise of it, and would recommend. And the next romance series I'm going to recommend is Tessa Dare's Girl Meets Duke series. I talked about this recently in my romance recommendations video, so I'll link that below. But this is just the best modern historical romance series. I say that, it's like the only historical romance series I've read, but I really like it. And I'll just kind of describe the first book, The Duchess Deal. We follow our main character. She's a seamstress and has just kind of been on her own after her dad kind of disowned her after some things happened in her adolescence, and she's just been making a living for herself as a seamstress, and she meets a grumpy duke who just ended an engagement but had already bought his ex-fiance's wedding dress. So she shows up at his house in this wedding dress demanding payment for it, and he's like, well, I need a wife and you're getting to almost be a spinster, so why don't we just get married? And they have a marriage of convenience. And our Duke is kind of grumpy because he was in a war and he was in an accident and half of his face is kind of like disfigured, so he's kind of become a recluse in society. But these books are so funny, there's such good humor and there's such good banter between the characters, and they get pretty steamy. I've enjoyed every book in this series, so give it a read this spring. And then I have a couple, I guess you would call them young adult contemporaries, and they kind of go together. I'm going to recommend Be Not Far From Me by Mindy McGinnis. This was my favorite book that I read in 2020. This is a survival story, and we follow a high school junior. She's about to go into her senior year, so it's like spring. It is springtime in this, and she is at a party with some of her friends, and she catches her boyfriend cheating on her, and she's drunk, and she runs off into the wilderness of the Smoky Mountains and gets lost. But she has some survival skills, and she's an outdoorsy person, and she perseveres for an undisclosed, I will not disclose the amount of time, in the wilderness, and we follow her story, and I just really enjoyed it. I don't read a lot of young adult contemporaries, so I don't know if I'm the best judge of quality, but I personally really enjoyed this book. And that leads me into my second recommendation here is Hatchet by Gary Paulson. We're recommending some, I guess, is this middle grade? I read this when I was in 4th grade. This is a survival story, and Mindy McGinnis actually described Be Not Far From Me as drunk Hatchet with a girl. So I'm gonna recommend Hatchet if you haven't read it, if you didn't have to read this in school. This is a survival story following our main character, Brian. I think he's 13, and he is in a plane crash in the Canadian wilderness. It's been a long time since I read this book, but I want to pick it up again soon, and I think it would be a great story to read this spring, especially if you haven't already. Is this a classic? I mean, I don't even know how old this book is, if it's old enough to be a classic, but would recommend. This was one of those books where, you know how like when you're reading books for school as a young, like 11 or 12-year-old, and you have to pretend like you're not having a good time? I had to pretend like I wasn't having a good time, but I enjoyed this book. And now we'll get into some fantasy, and going off of that, I'll recommend some middle grade fantasy, but like, this is Percy Jackson. This is the first book in the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series. This is The Lightning Thief. This is middle grade, Greek-inspired fantasy, and we follow our main character, Percy, who finds out that he is a son of Poseidon, and he goes to Camp Half-Blood to meet some other cool demigods and other mystical creatures and go on adventures. Perfect, lighthearted, springtime read. But also, like, you know, there's some drama too in these middle grade fantasies. And this is by Rick Riordan, if I didn't mention that. But obviously, like, if you're on BookTube, you have heard about Percy Jackson before and you've probably read it. But here's my blurb talking about it. And then I will jump into Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. I just recently finished this, and let me tell you, this is so good. This is a young adult fantasy, and we follow our main character, Laszlo Strange. He is an orphan, and he grows up being a librarian. And he's kind of looked down upon because he doesn't have a lot of clout in society. And that's fine with Laszlo, because all he wants to do is read fairy tales about this city that disappeared and everyone thinks never existed. But Laszlo feels things related to this city, and he gets a chance to maybe take a visit there when a convoy of interesting people come through his city to look for people to go on an expedition to the city of Weep. There are godlike beings in this book, if that's something that you like in your fantasy. There is exploration of grief and just a lot of great adventure and characters and storytelling, and just, it's a beautiful book. And then I have a few nonfictions I want to recommend. I read a lot of nonfiction. I mainly listen to nonfiction on audio, but I feel like I don't get to talk about it very much, so I'm going to recommend a David Sedaris book, and that is Let's Explore Diabetes with Owls. This book is so funny. If you like dry humor and funny stories and just hearing people talk about their lives in a very humorous way, that's this book. This is the first David Sedaris book that I read, and it is just so funny. What can I say more about it? It's stories from his life, from his childhood, from his adolescence to his adulthood. It's just stories from his life and his take on humanity. It's really funny and really good. I would recommend, obviously, because it's in my recommendations video. And then another funny book is Modern Romance by Aziz Ansari. One, he reads this audiobook. Also, David Sedaris reads his audiobook. But he is just so funny to listen to. This is him, like, he actually does some research in this, and it is just studying like ways that dating has evolved and how relationships have evolved and how different cultures do dating now. This is so good. This was one of the very first audiobooks I listened to. And Aziz is obviously so funny, but it's also very insightful, and I enjoyed it very much. Also, the cover is just grade A. And then another audiobook read by the fabulous author is Girl Logic by Eliza Schlesinger, and she's a comedian. Aziz is a comedian too. I don't know if I need to mention that. Anyway, this is Eliza's book on life advice, basically. And also like kind of like a memoir too. You know, these celebrity memoirs. I can eat them up, okay? And Eliza gives really good advice, and she's obviously hilarious. And she just talks about her life, like how she got to be where she is in a very obviously male-dominated career, being a comedian. She's just great, and I really like hearing her talk and like hearing her perspective on things and like hearing about her journey to where she is now. So, great book. Another fabulous cover. And lastly, I want to recommend a classic. I want to recommend Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. I think this would be considered a classic. I think it came out in the 1930s, like 1937. But this is I guess you would call it a coming of age story of a young black girl. We start following her when she is a teenager, I believe, and her grandmother was a slave and she was raped by her owner and gave birth to her daughter, who was then raped by a school teacher who then gave birth to our main character. So she comes from a very traumatic generation of women. And we follow our main character, Janie, as she just kind of becomes herself from her teenage years into her early adulthood, into her older adulthood. And we follow her as she kind of has a marriage to escape the life that she's living in. And we see her navigate a difficult marriage and also just be part of the community that she's in, and then kind of take charge of her life as she goes on. This is a really good book. I had to read this in my AP literature class in high school, and at this point in my school career, I didn't have to pretend like I wasn't enjoying the books we were reading, and I loved this book. And then obviously we watched the movie because that's what you do in high school. I would recommend. This was really powerful and impactful. I read it, let's see, my senior year of high school was in 2013, so I read that 8 years ago. Was it 8 years ago? Wow. I read this 8 years ago and I'm still thinking about it. And I don't own a copy of it, and perhaps I should. But if you watched my last vlog, I'm not allowed to buy any books. So anyway, those are some springtime book recommendations for you. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in my next one.